One word changed everything. One word from a 10-year-old boy that silenced 18,000 screaming fans in 3 seconds flat. One word that made John Lennon stop mid-song, drop his guitar and walk off the stage. One word that was captured on live television, then mysteriously erased from every official record.
That word was Dad.
But this story was buried, hidden, scrubbed from history by the most powerful music industry machine in the world. The 18,000 witnesses were told they imagined it. The footage disappeared. The boy vanished without a trace. Until now. What you're about to hear is the untold story of the night the Beatles discovered that fame means nothing when a child calls your name. The night John Lennon faced a truth he'd been running from for 11 years. The night that changed rock and roll forever. And it started with screams. Deafening, bone-crushing, earth-shaking screams. August 15, 1965. Shea Stadium, New York. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an energy that bordered on violence. 56,000 square feet of concrete and steel trembling under the weight of pure, unadulterated hysteria. 18,000 voices shrieking as one primal scream that could be heard for miles across Queens. The ground beneath the stage actually shook. Engineers would later marvel that the structure held together at all. The Beatles had just taken the stage, for silhouettes against blinding white spotlights that turned them into mythical figures rather than mere mortals. Their instruments were barely audible over the chaos, the carefully crafted melodies of their songs completely lost in the tsunami of adolescent worship. This wasn't just a concert, this was a religious experience, a mass hysteria event that psychologists would study for decades to come. John Lennon gripped his Rickenbacker, sweat already beading on his forehead despite having been on stage for less than 2 minutes. The heat was suffocating, a combination of the August humidity, the blazing stage lights, and the body heat of 18,000 fevered fans creating a greenhouse effect that made breathing difficult. Camera flashes exploded like lightning strikes across the darkened stadium, creating a strobe effect that was both mesmerizing and disorienting. Each flash revealed glimpses of the crowd, mouths open in perpetual screams, hands stretched toward the sky, tears of joy streaming down countless faces. Paul bounced at his microphone, that famous grin stretched across his face, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his shoulders. His eyes were scanning the crowd with practiced wariness, always alert for potential danger. They'd seen fans break through barriers before. They'd witnessed the frightening power of mob mentality. George stood rigid, fingers moving across his strings with mechanical precision, his face a mask of concentration as he tried to find their rhythm in the chaos. Behind them all, Ringo's drumsticks cut through the air like a metronome fighting against a hurricane, his steady beat the only anchor keeping them grounded in reality. This was Beatlemania at its most violent peak, and they were powerless to control it. The opening chords of Twist and Shout rang out, swallowed instantly by the screaming mob. The sound system, the most powerful ever assembled at that time, was completely overwhelmed. Teenage girls pressed against the barriers with such force that the metal guardrails began to bend. Their faces were contorted with an emotion that went beyond joy, beyond excitement. This was something primal, something desperate. Tears streaming down their faces, reaching desperately toward the stage as if they could somehow touch the divine, somehow become part of the magic that was happening before their eyes. Security guards formed a human wall, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were all that stood between order and complete chaos. Their hands constantly moved to restrain the surge of bodies threatening to break free, each guard responsible for holding back dozens of frenzied fans. In the wings, more security personnel stood ready, some of them veterans of boxing matches and political rallies, all of them admitting later that they'd never experienced anything quite like this. Police officers stationed throughout the stadium spoke into their radios with increasing concern. The crowd wasn't just loud, it was unstable, unpredictable, teetering on the edge of something that could turn dangerous in seconds. But something was different tonight. Something that would shatter the carefully orchestrated chaos and change everything forever. In the third row, pressed between a sobbing 16-year-old clutching a homemade sign and a woman wearing a "Marry Me Paul" button the size of a dinner plate, stood a child. A boy no more than 10 years old, maybe 11 at most. His clothing was different from everyone around him, not the bright colors and trendy outfits of the teenage fans, but simple, worn clothes that spoke of modest means. His face was streaked with tears, but not tears of joy or excitement like those surrounding him. These were different, desperate, determined, raw with a grief that seemed far too adult for someone so young. The woman beside him, later revealed to be his Aunt Margaret, kept one protective hand on his shoulder while using the other to shield him from the pressing crowd. Her own face showed a mixture of hope, terror, and resignation, as if she knew they were about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The Beatles launched into their second song, the familiar rhythm of their performance machine clicking into place. The crowd's fever pitched higher, if such a thing were even impossible. Voices grew hoarse from screaming, yet still they screamed. Arms ached from reaching, yet still they reached. This was mass hypnosis on an unprecedented scale. But the boy wasn't screaming. He wasn't reaching. He wasn't lost in the collective madness surrounding him. He was shouting something else. Something impossible to hear over the chaos of 18,000 voices raised in worship. Something that would stop the biggest band in the world dead in their tracks. Until suddenly, it wasn't impossible to hear anymore. Dad. The word cut through the noise like a blade through silk, carrying with it a desperation that 18,000 screaming fans couldn't drown out. John's fingers faltered on his guitar, the chord progression stumbling for the first time anyone could remember. For just a moment, a fraction of a second that seemed to stretch into eternity, his head turned toward the crowd. His eyes, magnified behind those thick-rimmed glasses that had become as iconic as the music itself, searched the sea of faces with sudden, sharp focus. Had he heard correctly? In this maelstrom of sound, in this hurricane of human emotion, had he really heard what he thought he'd heard? His heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, just the stress of performing, the heat, the overwhelming sensory overload that came with being a Beatle. But deep down, in a place he tried to lock away years ago, he knew better. Daddy, it's me. This time there was absolutely no mistaking it. The voice was small but piercing, carrying a desperation that somehow made it rise above 18,000 screaming fans like a single candle flame visible in complete darkness. The acoustics of the stadium, designed to carry sound to every seat, seemed to amplify this one voice while muffling all others. John's guitar went completely silent. His hands remained on the strings, trembling slightly, but no sound emerged. His breathing became shallow, rapid. Paul noticed first, his bass instincts as sharp as his musical ones. The rhythm section was falling apart, and Paul's eyes darted to John with genuine concern. He'd seen his bandmate through drug episodes, through violent fans, through the pressures that came with being the most famous people on earth. But this was different. This was fear. This was recognition. George felt the rhythm shift like an earthquake beneath his feet and looked back at Ringo, whose steady beat had been their anchor through 3 years of chaos. Ringo's eyes were wide behind his drum kit, his sticks hovering in midair as he tried to understand what was happening to the song, to the show, to his friend. The crowd sensed something was catastrophically wrong. 18,000 people who had come expecting a precisely choreographed performance were witnessing something unrehearsed, something real, something that scared them. The screaming began to falter, like a radio slowly being turned down by an invisible hand. Individual voices became audible for the first time since the show began. Whispers rippled through the stadium like wildfire, spreading from row to row with increasing urgency. What's happening to John? Why did the music stop? Is this part of the show? Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. Security guards positioned around the stage began speaking into their radios, their voices tight with concern. The television cameras that had been focused on capturing the band's performance suddenly zoomed in on John's face, broadcasting his confusion and growing panic to millions of viewers watching at home. In television control rooms, directors debated whether to cut the feed, whether this moment was too private, too raw for public consumption. The boy was on his feet now, standing precariously on his chair, his small hands cupped around his mouth like a megaphone. The teenage girls around him had stopped screaming entirely, turning to stare at this strange child who seemed immune to the Beatles' spell. Tears streaming down his cheeks as he called out again and again, his voice cracking with emotion but never giving up. John, it's Tommy. Tommy Mitchell. My mom said you're my dad. She told me to find you. The words hit John Lennon like a physical blow, like a punch to the solar plexus that left him gasping. His face went completely pale under the harsh stage lights, the color draining so quickly that makeup artists in the wings later swore you could see it happening in real time. The Rickenbacker slipped slightly in his sweating hands, and for a moment it seemed like he might drop it entirely. His knees buckled slightly, and he took an unconscious step backward, as if trying to escape the words that were chasing him across the stage. Behind him, Ringo's drumsticks finally went completely still, resting on the cymbals like a funeral dirge that had found its ending. 18,000 people fell into an eerie, unprecedented silence that seemed to violate the very laws of physics. The silence was so complete, so absolute, that you could hear the hum of the amplifiers, the buzz of the stadium lights, the distant sound of traffic outside. People in the back rows, hundreds of yards from the stage, could suddenly hear every word being spoken at ground level. You could hear individual heartbeats. You could hear the wind moving through the stadium. You could hear a pin drop in Shea Stadium, and everyone there knew they were witnessing something that would never happen again. Security guards near the stage exchanged panicked looks, their training completely inadequate for this scenario. They'd been briefed on fan rushes, on medical emergencies, on equipment failures, but no one had prepared them for this. How do you handle a child claiming one of the Beatles is his father? How do you manage a situation that's being broadcast live to millions? Do you remove him and risk looking heartless? Do you ignore it and let a child's heart break on national television? Do you let it play out and risk destroying the career of one of the most famous men in the world? The television director in the control truck was frantically trying to decide whether to cut the cameras, whether to protect John's privacy, whether this moment was too intimate for public consumption. His finger hovered over the button that would take them to commercial, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the journalist's instinct for a story. Maybe it was simple human curiosity. Maybe it was the recognition that they were witnessing something historic. Whatever it was, the cameras kept rolling. The woman next to the boy, his aunt, as it would later be revealed, wrapped her arms around his trembling shoulders. She leaned down and whispered something in his ear, then looked directly at the stage with an expression that mixed hope and heartbreak in equal measure. John took a step forward, then another. The microphone crackled as he moved closer to the edge of the stage, closer to the crowd, closer to the boy who claimed to be his son. "What did you say?" John's voice carried across the silent stadium, amplified by speakers that moments before had been competing with screams. "If you were there that night, if you subscribed to this channel of untold stories, you'd know that what happened next would be talked about in whispers for decades. But the official records? They were scrubbed clean. This moment that 18,000 people witnessed, it officially never happened." The boy looked up at John with eyes that were unmistakably familiar. The same nose, the same stubborn set to his jaw, the same vulnerability hiding behind a mask of defiance. "My name is Tommy Mitchell," the boy called out, his voice breaking. "My mom, she died last month. Cancer. She told me before she went. She told me you were my real dad. She said you met her in Liverpool in 1954. She said your real name was John Winston Lennon and you had a scar on your hand from when you fell off your bike as a kid." John's left hand instinctively moved to cover his right palm, where indeed a thin white scar ran from his thumb to his wrist. A scar that had never been photographed, never been mentioned in interviews, never been public knowledge. The stadium held its breath. Paul had moved closer to John now, his bass hanging silent at his side. George and Ringo had abandoned their instruments entirely and walked to the front of the stage. They formed a protective semicircle around their bandmate, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. John's voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone caught every word. "What was your mother's name?" "Sarah," the boy replied, his voice stronger now. "Sarah Mitchell. But she said you knew her as Sally. She had red hair and freckles and she worked at the Cavern Club cleaning tables. She said you wrote her letters, but she never got them because her dad threw them away." The color drained from John's face entirely. His legs seemed to give way slightly, and Paul instinctively reached out to steady him. Everyone in that stadium knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something private made public, something that would either be the most beautiful moment in rock and roll history or the most cruel hoax ever perpetrated. But as they watched John Lennon, the sharp-tongued, quick-witted Beatle who always had an answer for everything, stand speechless on that stage, they began to believe. What would you have done in John's place? Ignore the claim and continue the show? Demand proof? Or stop everything, your career, your reputation, your carefully constructed public image, for the possibility that a grieving child might be telling the truth? Do you believe a child's voice could silence thousands of screaming fans? Could cut through the noise of fame and fortune and reach something real? Was it just confusion and wishful thinking? Or was it destiny finally catching up? John made his choice. He set down his guitar and walked to the very edge of the stage. The security guard stepped aside as he knelt down, bringing himself as close to eye level with the boy as the barrier would allow. "Can you come closer?" John asked, his voice gentle now, all the rock star bravado stripped away. The security team looked to each other, then to the stadium management in the wings. This was unprecedented. This was chaos. This was human. They nodded. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as security guards carefully escorted Tommy and his aunt toward the stage. The walk seemed to take forever. 18,000 people watched in absolute silence as a small boy moved through their ranks, his hand held tightly by a woman who looked as terrified as she was hopeful. When they reached the stage, John was already there, having jumped down from the platform despite the protests of security. He stood face to face with the boy, studying his features with an intensity that made everyone present hold their breath. For 30 seconds they simply looked at each other. Then John did something that no one expected. He smiled. Not the practiced smile of a performer, but something real, something broken, something beautiful. "You have her eyes," he said quietly, but the microphone systems picked it up, carrying his words to every corner of the stadium. "Sally always had the most beautiful green eyes." Tommy's face crumpled with relief and joy and grief all at once. John opened his arms, and the boy collapsed into them, sobbing into the shoulder of the man who might or might not be his father, but who was certainly the first adult to believe his story. The crowd erupted, not in screams this time but in something deeper. Cheers mixed with sobs. Applause thundered through the stadium. Even the security guards were wiping their eyes. John held the boy for a long moment, whispering something in his ear that no microphone would ever capture. Then he looked up at the 18,000 witnesses to this moment and made an announcement that would become the stuff of legend. "We're going to play something special tonight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This one's for Sally and for everyone who never got to say goodbye." He climbed back onto the stage, helped Tommy and his aunt to seats in the VIP section, and picked up his guitar. Paul, George, and Ringo took their positions without a word. They all knew what song was coming. Yesterday. As Paul's voice filled the stadium, something magical happened. 18,000 people who had come to scream and faint and lose themselves in hysteria instead sat in perfect reverent silence. They listened, they felt, they understood that they were witnessing something sacred. Many of them cried. When the song ended, John looked directly at Tommy and nodded. The boy nodded back, understanding something that the rest of the world could only guess at. The Beatles played 3 more songs that night, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The screaming never returned. Instead, the crowd listened with the intensity of a congregation, as if they were in church rather than a rock concert. When the show ended and the house lights came up, Tommy and his aunt were gone. No one knew where they went. No one got their story. Security claimed they had no record of the incident. The television footage from that night mysteriously disappeared from the archives. Official Beatles biographies never mentioned it, but 18,000 people remembered. They remembered the night a child's voice silenced a stadium. They remembered watching John Lennon become human instead of just a Beatle. They remembered the power of a story that might have been true, might have been fantasy, but was definitely real in all the ways that matter. Over the years, investigators tried to track down Tommy Mitchell. Some claimed to have found him, a man living quietly in Canada, a teacher in Australia, a mechanic in Detroit, but none of them would confirm the story. If any of them were the real Tommy, they had chosen silence over fame. Perhaps that was the point. John never spoke publicly about that night, but those close to him noticed changes. He became more involved with children's charities. He started answering more fan mail, especially letters from kids who said they missed their parents. And sometimes, late at night in the studio, he would play Yesterday, and his eyes would get distant, as if he was remembering something precious and painful. The official story is that nothing unusual happened at Shea Stadium on August 15, 1965. The Beatles played their set, the crowd screamed, everyone went home. But the truth, as it often does, lives in the spaces between official records. It lives in the memories of 18,000 witnesses who swear they saw something impossible. The moment when the world's biggest rock stars stopped being performers and became human beings. The moment when a child's desperate love cut through the noise of fame and forced everyone to remember what really mattered. That night, in front of 18,000